Well, when they got her to the autopsy table and opened up, her brain, they realized she'd been hit over the head.
And then Netflix shows a very graphic image of JonBenet's skull with a massive 8-inch crack running along the top of it. A small section about the size of a man's thumb is caved in. We aren't showing the image Netflix shows halfway through episode 1, but suffice it to say, this was a massive blow. Then Netflix pontificates about whether the injury was made by a Maglite flashlight or a baseball bat. Curiously, Netflix doesn't show another candidate for this bludgeoning instrument, a set of golf clubs that belonged to John that was right outside the wine cellar in the basement. Also, a urine stain was found on the carpet very close to those golf clubs. And yet there was something incredibly bizarre about this catastrophic injury. Whatever caused it, whatever the instrument was, for all the internal violence to JonBenet's skull and brain, her scalp, the skin surrounding this tissue, was unbroken. This is made explicit in the autopsy report through 5 simple words. No scalp trauma identified. There was no external sign whatsoever on her head, in her hair, of the injury underneath. Meanwhile, as is so typical of the Ramsey case, just below the surface, wild hurricanes of damage were whirling and reaping.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime.
You know how much blood was found in JonBenet Ramsey's head from that 8.5-inch fracture? 7 cc's, which is a teaspoon and a half.
Why is there so little blood in this child's brain given the monstrous injury to it? Well, before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Look out for the next analysis where we'll be looking at the one article I've found that basically criticizes the Netflix docuseries. Out of all the media, I've just found one article, and it's a pretty good article as well. Through the course of this episode, I'll be revealing not one card, but 2. So make sure you have your notebooks at the ready. Do you still know what the first card was? The Ace of Hearts. And then if you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So the question is, how do we explain not only this massive injury, which cracked bone, yet it didn't manage to break the skin? How's that possible? Well, do you want me to answer the question?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
And that brings us to the Ace of Clubs. The answer is, in my opinion, quite simple, and it has to do with physical properties of energy distribution, elasticity of certain materials, and the deformation of certain materials. And by addressing this question, we also end up stumbling, as I say, onto the Ace of Clubs, which is the bludgeoning instrument. We'll get to that in a moment, but we also need to address several other enigmas in the autopsy. What happened first, asphyxia or the blow? What was the time between each? And then finally, the Ace of Spades, who is the perpetrator? And then what does all of this tell us about the identity of JonBenet's killer? We're going to go through 4 insights from the autopsy, and let's start at number 1, which is the bludgeoning instrument. Without going into too much detail, a combination of the surface area and surface shape, as well as the relative inelastic properties of the Maglite flashlight and the golf clubs, that, in my opinion, rules both of these items out without our even needing to examine or test them for fingerprints, for fibers, for DNA, or anything else. And that leaves us with the softball bat, what Netflix incorrectly, as far as I know, refers to as a baseball bat. Netflix also incorrectly states that no evidence was found on the bat outside.
But there's no physical evidence on the flashlight or on the bat?
Well, except it seems there was. Smith said that an aluminium baseball bat with carpet fibers from inside the Ramsey house was found outside a broken basement window. And Wickman is a tad disingenuous here, in my opinion, to call it the Ramsey's bat, because it didn't belong to John. And on Dr. Phil in 2016, Burke admitted it was his.
They show you either of those items?
They showed me a picture of the baseball bat, like on the side of the house or something.
Yeah.
That was my baseball bat. I would normally like leave it out on the patio.
So an intruder could have picked that up on.
Well, okay, so the intruder picked up the bat, took it inside, used it, and then carried it outside and put it back where Burke left it. So the smooth, round surface and the relatively soft, deformative properties of aluminum make it, in my opinion, a strong candidate for the bludgeoning weapon. Further, a window directly above the bat was Burke's bedroom, which is the first floor bedroom with 3 narrow vertical windows above the front door facing the street. Personally, I think this bat was thrown out the window shortly after the child's scream, and that's what made the metal clanking on concrete sound heard by Luther Stanton, the neighbor diagonally across from the Ramseys. Now, there are actually a number of bats outside in the garden, which does kind of complicate this whole thing. I'm trying to keep it simple by just referring to one in this instance. Number 2, first strangled, then struck.
I don't know what ultimately killed her, whether or not it was the strangulation or the blow to the head. The evidence from both is there.
She's right, the evidence from both is there. And although Woodward isn't sure which came first, the asphyxia or the head blow, based on some of the research I've read, the blow to the head would not have been fatal, according to some, if JonBenet had received immediate medical attention. As bad as that looks, it would not necessarily have been fatal. The ligature, of course, is far, far more serious and was ultimately unsurvivable. The question, though, is which came first?
Let me tell you what I believe.
There are 2 aspects to this that provide a critical template with which to draw inferences. The first is Dr. Wach's observation about the strangely small amount of blood in the brain, just a teaspoon and a half. The reason for this isn't that the injury wasn't severe, because it was, or that it didn't cause severe hemorrhage, because it did. The reason there was so little bleeding was because the ligature was applied seconds or moments before, or close to simultaneously. There was no bleeding in the brain because the blood supply to the brain had just been cut off on all sides at the throat. And where does the brain receive blood from? Well, from below the head, where the pump, the heart, is located. And that sort of location was shut off by the ligature. The other aspect to consider are the petechial hemorrhages, tiny ruptures which occur in small blood vessels called capillaries. Petechial hemorrhages are a classic symptom of asphyxia. Many of us know this in true crime. And that tells us JonBenet was alive and conscious when asphyxiated. I must say, our heart certainly goes out to her in that respect, because that couldn't have been pleasant. The blow that would have struck her unconscious would, in my opinion, likely have been made after the ligature was applied and allowed enough opportunity for the petechia to form in the first place. Another way of saying this is that JonBenet had to have been breathing in order for these hemorrhages to be possible.
Is it really so hard to believe?
Number 3, the answer is time.
And he said, but what you need to know, if anyone's speculating about it, is that you cannot even say 5 seconds separated them. They happened as close to simultaneous as possible.
Now, although I agree with that, this is not what people have thought through the course of this case. There were times when they thought that there was an hour separating the head blow between the ligature strangulation. I think Detective Steve Thomas thought that the ligature strangulation was actually just staged, that it was done post-mortem, which I think shows a lack of ability to read autopsy evidence. But I do think this is one of the most vital insights into the absolute epicenter of this case. And so many people have gotten it wrong, and so many people struggle to understand it. Because it's the very moment the crime was executed that we need to understand. And it's not easy. In my view, a near simultaneous, very forceful blow, as well as a ligature strangulation, implies not one perpetrator but two. Think about what we're talking about here. A near simultaneous, forceful blow. It's not like a slight blow to the head. It's a very forceful blow as well as a vigorous ligature strangulation. Doesn't it imply that there are two people exerting two different weapons on this little girl almost at the same time? One is armed, if that's the word, with the paintbrush and noose. The other is unarmed, but then leaps up to arm himself with a nearby bat, and in a panic, he smashes it down. And this is done not to kill JonBenet, but to silence her. And that brings us to the Ace of Spades. In this scenario, we also have some indirect confirmation. The fact that the blow to the head is from above means she could not have been lying down with her back and, of course, the top of her head facing the floor. This is likely the position she was initially in, and then she felt a sharp pain, screamed out, and then turned on towards her stomach to crawl away when she was struck. And that is how her hands ended up above her head, and also why her head was turned to one side when she was found. Then the ligature could have been tightened on purpose, it could have been tightened by mistake, or it could have been tightened in a combination of these during a frantic episode in a dimly lit room late at night. JonBenet might have trampled on the paintbrush with her knee, and another part of the cord may have caught on a foot or a chair leg or the edge of a wall-mounted heater, and this, of course, is contingent on where in the house the incident occurred. And what was the sort of furniture, what was the detritus on the floor in different parts of the home. If you imagine that the child has the paintbrush wedged under her knee and she's trying to move forward or she's trying to stand up, well, any movement would have inexorably tightened this noose, snaring it into her hair and gold chain as she strained to stand up and escape. And of course, this is a one-way knot.
Which brings us at last to the moment of truth.
And so here is another card, the Ace of Spades. Number 4, two perpetrators, but which two? The bat and the location of the bat both indicate, in my view, a different candidate from an imputed perpetrator wielding the flashlight or an imputed perpetrator wielding a golf club. It also, for that matter, implies a different area of the house, not the kitchen in the case of the flashlight, nor the basement in the case of the golf clubs. And this is just my feeling, this is just my view, this is just my belief. I think the housekeeper would know the answer to this one way or another. I just have a hard time thinking softball bats were kept in the basement, but I suppose it's possible. I think the housekeeper could otherwise tell us where the softball bats were normally kept in the house. Has that question ever been asked? I know we've been told that the bats were all left outside, but is that absolutely true? We can also draw potentially this inference, that one perpetrator stood over JonBenet, who was in a crawling position. The other was likely on the floor, closer to her head and shoulders. And so I think if you take the autopsy evidence together, and it obviously includes this heart that the coroner said he saw in her hand, and you take the evidence of the autopsy as well, these two serious injuries, which is really overkill if it's one perpetrator. If it's two, well, then it might be a little bit different. If you put them together, does the theory hold? Well, what do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.